When the world sleeps, shadows awaken. This is where the forgotten tales breathe again. Welcome to Dark Night Story. When night falls, the world changes. Shadows grow longer, silence deepens, and the places we think we know so well suddenly feel unfamiliar. Tonight, I want to share with you a terrifying true encounter, a story whispered in hushed tones across the United States. The story of a woman who found herself being followed by something she could never explain. This is the Stalker in the empty parking lot. It was late in the fall of 1997. A young woman named Michelle had just finished her night shift at a small-town diner in Indiana. The place had closed for the night, and Michelle was exhausted. She carried her jacket, her handbag, and her car keys jingled faintly in her hand. The parking lot was almost completely empty, just rows of cracked pavement, patches of flickering yellow streetlights, and the cool mist of an early November night. Michelle knew this lot well. She parked in the far corner every evening. But that night, as she stepped out into the quiet, she felt uneasy. She walked across the lot, the sound of her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the concrete. And then she heard it. Another set of footsteps. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe one of the cooks was leaving, maybe someone else had parked out back. But when she turned her head, the lot looked empty. The sound stopped whenever she stopped. It started again whenever she began to walk. Her pulse quickened. Michelle reached for her keys, trying not to look panicked. That's when she noticed something. Under the nearest streetlight, about 30 feet away, a shadow. It looked like the silhouette of a man, but there was no man standing there. No body, no face, just a long, distorted shadow stretching across the asphalt, as if cast by something invisible. Michelle froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow twitched, and then it began to move. Michelle forced herself to walk faster, fumbling to unlock her car. The shadow followed, stretching unnaturally, sliding across the pavement like water. Her heart pounded in her chest. She dared not look back fully, but out of her corner of an eye, she saw the shape growing taller, thinner, like it was reaching for her. Finally, she yanked her car door open and jumped inside. She slammed the lock down with trembling hands, started the engine, and looked up, and the shadow was right at her driver's side window. Michelle screamed. She floored the accelerator, tires squealing as the car lurched forward. For a split second, the shadow stretched with her car, as if clinging to it, and then it vanished. She didn't stop driving until she reached her apartment complex, miles away. But even then, when she stepped out into the safety of her own parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her home. The next morning, shaken but determined, Michelle told her manager what had happened. He paled. "You're not the first," he said. Other employees had reported hearing footsteps in that lot. Some even claimed to have seen a tall, faceless man near the streetlights who disappeared if you got too close. Local legend suggested that years earlier, a man had been killed in that very parking lot, stabbed after a late-night argument, and that his restless spirit still lingered. To this day, Michelle refuses to park in the far corner of that lot. And even now, nearly 30 decades later, diners and locals alike whisper about the presence, the phantom stalker who watches from under the streetlight. So the next time you find yourself alone, late at night, in an empty parking lot, and you hear footsteps that shouldn't be there. Remember Michelle's story, because sometimes the shadows aren't empty. Sometimes they're watching. Next story. Some places die long before their walls collapse. The paint fades, the lights burn out, but something unseen lingers inside, waiting. Tonight's story takes us back to the late 1970s, to a lonely stretch of highway in the American Midwest, a crumbling roadside motel where guests checked in but never truly left. This is the story of the knock from the abandoned motel room. It was the summer of 1978. A traveling salesman named Robert Klein was making his way through Indiana on a long business trip. He'd been driving for hours, his eyes heavy, when he spotted a faded neon sign glowing weakly in the distance. Lakeview Motor Lodge, vacancy. The motel looked half abandoned. Paint peeled from the walls. The swimming pool was drained and cracked, and only 2 of the neon letters flickered. But Robert was exhausted. He pulled into the gravel lot and walked to the front office. Inside sat an older woman with sharp eyes and a smile that felt forced. She handed him a key attached to a large brass tag. She said, "Room 6. Try to get some rest." The room was plain, brown carpet, a sagging bed, and a single lamp buzzing faintly. Robert unpacked his suitcase, locked the door, and lay down. Just after midnight, knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp raps at his door. Robert sat up. "Hello?" he called. No answer. He checked through the curtains. No one in sight. The lot was empty except for his own car. He shook his head and returned to bed. But as soon as he drifted off, knock, knock, knock. This time, louder. Robert yanked the door open, and the hallway was empty. The next morning, Robert stepped outside and noticed a man smoking by the vending machine. He looked like a trucker, his face weathered, his eyes tired. "You in room 6?" he asked. Robert nodded. The trucker dropped his cigarette, grinding it out with his boot. "Don't stay there another night," he said flatly. "That room, it ain't right." When Robert asked why, the trucker just muttered, "People hear things, things knocking, things that ain't human." Before Robert could press him further, the trucker climbed into his rig and drove away. Curious and unsettled, Robert returned to the front desk that afternoon. The old woman looked up as he approached. "Is there something wrong with my room?" he asked. Her expression tightened. "No," she said. But after a pause, her voice lowered. 30 years ago, a young couple checked into room 6. They fought all night long. By morning, only one of them checked out. The story went that the young woman was found dead, locked inside the room, with bruises on her arms and terror frozen on her face. The man had vanished. Since then, guests reported strange knocks at the door at midnight, but when they looked, no one was there. Robert tried to brush it off as superstition. He returned to his room that night, telling himself it was just a story. At midnight, the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Robert's heart pounded. He sat perfectly still, refusing to answer. The knocks grew louder. Knock, knock, knock. Then came a whisper, so close it sounded as if it were pressed against the wood. "Let me in." Robert leapt to the door, flinging it open. Nothing, just silence. But when he turned back toward his bed, the lamp flickered, and on the mirror above the dresser, faint handprints began to appear. By 3 a.m., Robert had given up on sleep. He sat in the chair, staring at the door, his suitcase packed and ready to go. That's when the final knock came. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was inside, behind the bathroom door. Knock, knock, knock. Robert's breath caught in his chest. Slowly, trembling, he opened the bathroom door. The light inside was out, but in the mirror above the sink, he saw the reflection of a woman standing behind him. Her eyes were black, her mouth opened wide in a silent scream. Robert spun around, and the bathroom was empty. Robert didn't hesitate. He grabbed his suitcase, sprinted out of the room, and never looked back. When he returned the key to the front desk, the old woman didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded. "Most don't stay 2 nights," she said. Robert drove until dawn, not stopping until he was 2 states away. The Lakeview Motor Lodge closed its doors in the early 1980s. It was left to rot by the roadside, the sign eventually collapsing, the rooms filling with dust and weeds. But travelers who pass by at night still swear they see a faint yellow light glowing in the window of room 6. And some say they hear it, 3 slow knocks echoing from behind the locked door. Knock, knock, knock. So if you ever find yourself on a lonely highway, staring at the glowing sign of an abandoned motel, think twice before stopping, because not all doors are meant to be opened. Next story. Some horrors do not live in the woods. They do not linger in abandoned houses or forgotten graveyards. Some horrors stand silently under a streetlight. Tonight, we travel to Japan in the early 2000s, to a quiet suburb outside Tokyo, where one shadow refused to move. This is the story of the shadow under the streetlight. It was the winter of 2002. A university student named Aya Tanaka had just returned to her hometown after exams. Late one evening, she walked home from her part-time job at a bookstore. Her town was safe, quiet, the kind of place where children could still play outside at dusk. The streets were empty. The only sound was the distant hum of a vending machine and the clicking of her shoes against the pavement. And then she saw it. Beneath a tall streetlight at the end of her block, a shadow. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But as she drew closer, the shadow didn't shift with the angle of the lamp. It stood perfectly still, as if waiting. Aya slowed her pace. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, and entirely black, as if the light failed to touch it. It wasn't a person casting a shadow. It was the shadow itself. Its head was tilted slightly, as if watching her. Aya's stomach tightened. She forced herself to walk past, refusing to look back. But the moment she reached the next corner, she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, dragging footsteps, echoing just behind her. The next day, Aya mentioned the figure to her childhood friend, Haru. To her surprise, Haru's expression turned grim. "You shouldn't walk that road at night," he said. "People have seen it. They call it Kage no Hito, the shadow man." Aya laughed nervously. "You're joking." But Haru shook his head. He told her about an old rumor that in the late 1970s, a man had been struck and killed by a speeding car at that very streetlight. Ever since, late-night walkers reported seeing a shadow standing there. If you ignored it, nothing happened. But if you stared too long or spoke to it, it would follow you home. Aya tried to dismiss it as superstition. But a few nights later, her shift ended late again. She had no choice but to take the same road. When she reached the streetlight, the shadow was waiting. This time, she could see its head turn, not toward her, but toward the window of a nearby house. And then she noticed the house was completely dark, yet behind the glass, a pale face pressed against the window, staring at her. Aya's blood ran cold. She sprinted the rest of the way home. That night, Aya lay awake in bed. Just past 2 a.m., she heard a faint noise outside her window. Tap, 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 like fingers brushing the glass. She pulled back her curtain, and there it was. Not the pale face, not the figure under the lamp, but a shadow stretched impossibly long across the street, leading directly to her bedroom window. And in the pool of the streetlight below, the figure stood, motionless, waiting. Terrified, Aya went to the town library the next day. She searched for any record of the accident Haru had mentioned, and there it was. A newspaper clipping from 1978. Local businessman struck and killed at intersection. Driver never found. Victim pronounced dead under the streetlight. Beside the article was a grainy black and white photograph, a crumpled bicycle, a broken lamppost, and the faint outline of a shadow stretching across the road, even though the sun was high in the sky. Aya swore she would never walk that road again, but fate had other plans. One night, she missed the last bus. Her only path home was past the streetlight. She tried to run. Her footsteps echoed in the empty street, until she realized she wasn't alone. The shadow's footsteps followed, closer and closer. She glanced back, and the figure was no longer under the lamp. It was directly behind her. Its hand, long and black, reached toward her shoulder. Aya screamed, and everything went dark. The next morning, Haru came looking for her. They found Aya's bag on the sidewalk just beneath the streetlight. Her phone, her wallet, even the book she had been carrying. But Aya herself was gone. The police searched for weeks. No body was ever found. But late at night, passers-by began noticing something strange. The shadow beneath the lamp had changed. Where once it was a tall, thin man, it now looked like the outline of a young woman. Her head tilted, her hand raised, waiting for the next person to walk by. If you ever find yourself walking down a quiet Japanese street and you see a lone lamp flickering in the distance, don't look too closely at what stands beneath it, because some shadows are not cast by light. They are cast by death. Next story. Some houses are empty. Empty of life, empty of laughter. But sometimes they are not empty at all. In the winter of 1965, in a small town on the outskirts of Manchester, England, a family discovered that their new home held a secret. A secret that revealed itself in the dead of night, in the sound of a child's cry. This is the story of the cry in the empty house. The Holloway family moved into their new home in December of 1965. The father, Edward, had taken a new job at a textile factory. His wife, Margaret, was thrilled to finally leave the cramped flat they'd lived in for years. The house itself was old, 2 stories of gray stone with ivy creeping up the side. Its windows were tall, its wooden beams worn, but to Margaret, it was perfect. Their 2 children, Susan, age 9, and Peter, just 6, ran excitedly through the halls. For the first week, life in the house was ordinary, until the first night it snowed. It was nearly midnight when Margaret awoke to the sound. A faint, muffled noise, like a baby crying. At first, she thought it was Peter, but when she checked both children's rooms, they were fast asleep. The sound seemed to come from the hallway, a soft, pitiful wail that drifted through the walls. She woke Edward. He searched every room, even outside in the snow, but found nothing. The cries stopped as suddenly as they began. Margaret told herself it must have been the wind, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. Over the following weeks, the Holloways began to notice other things. Doors that creaked open on their own, cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and at night, the sound of footsteps, small, light footsteps padding across the upstairs landing. But the worst was the cry, always at night, always the sound of a child trapped and suffering, echoing from the empty house. Sometimes it was distant, barely audible. Other times it was right outside their bedroom door. Susan and Peter began complaining of nightmares. Susan swore she saw a boy standing in the corner of her room, his face pale, his clothes ragged. When Margaret asked what he looked like, she whispered, "He was crying, Mom, and he asked me to help him." Edward refused to believe in ghosts. He told his wife the children had overactive imaginations, but Margaret couldn't ignore the growing dread in the house. She went into town to ask the neighbors about the property. Most people avoided the subject, but one older woman, Mrs. Clark, finally spoke. "That house, it's not right." In the 1930s, a family lived there. The mother was widowed with a young boy, no older than 5. One winter, he disappeared. They searched everywhere, fields, rivers, woods. He was never found. The mother swore she heard him crying in the house. She died a few years later, alone. Margaret felt her blood run cold. The boy's ghost was still there. That winter grew harsher. The cries became louder. Sometimes the sound would wake both children, and they would come running into their parents' room, terrified. One night, Edward heard it too. A long, mournful cry, so real, so close, it froze him in place. He followed the sound to the attic.
When he pulled down the hatch and climbed the ladder, the air was bitterly cold. In the dust, he saw tiny footprints, child-sized, bare feet, and then the sound of crying directly behind him. But when he spun around, the attic was empty. By February, the family was at their breaking point. One night, the cries were unbearable, wailing, sobbing, echoing through every wall of the house. Margaret, trembling, called out into the darkness, "Who are you? What do you want?" The house fell silent. And then, a voice, small, weak, terrified. "Help me." The Holloways stared in horror. The cry was no longer muffled. It was in the same room. Susan pointed to the corner of the bedroom, and they saw him. A boy, no older than 6, his hair damp, his face streaked with tears. His skin was pale, almost blue, as if he'd been left out in the snow. "Help me," he whispered again. And then he was gone. Edward decided they would leave the house, but before they could, the haunting reached its peak. On their last night there, the cries began earlier than usual. This time, the boy appeared in the hallway. His small figure stood under the flickering light bulb. He reached out his hand, sobbing. The family froze. The air grew icy. The walls groaned. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of his crying. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The boy was gone. The house was still. The Holloways left the next morning and never returned. The house was sold several times over the decades, but each new tenant reported the same thing: the cries of a child echoing through the night, always in winter, always in the dark. To this day, locals still call it the empty house of Manchester. And some swear that if you stand outside on a snowy night, when the streets are quiet, you can hear it, a child's cry muffled by the walls, begging to be found. Some houses may stand empty, but emptiness is not silence. And in one old house in England, a lost child still cries, waiting for someone to listen.